Jake loved his peaceful backyard. It was his sanctuary, a quiet patch of green in a chaotic world. So when he walked out one sunny Saturday morning and nearly tripped over a string of white folding chairs, his brain short-circuited. His backyard had been transformed overnight into a full-blown wedding venue. Rows of chairs were lined up on his lawn, a flower arch was planted right in front of his garden gnome collection, and some random man in a headset was yelling at caterers to move the chafing dishes closer to the tent. At first, Jake thought he had the wrong yard. But then he saw her, Karen. She stood in the middle of it all like a proud dictator, clipboard in one hand and a walkie-talkie in the other. Her short, platinum-blonde bob was perfectly curled, her neon HOA badge pinned to her breast like a sheriff's star. She saw Jake and grinned like this was all perfectly normal. "Oh, good morning, Jake. Isn't it beautiful?" Jake blinked. "Karen, what the hell is going on in my yard?" She looked around, as if just now noticing the chaos. "Oh, this? My daughter's wedding. You weren't using the yard today, right?" Jake was speechless. This woman, this walking HOA nightmare, had just hijacked his property, like it was part of the community clubhouse. Karen waved her hand dismissively. "You weren't out here yesterday, and it's all part of the HOA anyway. We figured it was fine, community spirit and all that." "Karen," Jake said slowly, trying to keep his blood pressure below eruption, "this is my private property." Karen didn't miss a beat. "And we're all part of the same community. Besides, the venue we booked fell through. You wouldn't want to ruin a bride's special day, would you?" Before Jake could answer, a woman in a wedding dress stormed past him, barking orders about floral arrangements. Apparently, this was the bride, Karen's daughter. She didn't even glance at him. Jake turned back to Karen, jaw clenched. "You have until noon to clear this out." Karen scoffed. "Jake, let's not be dramatic. It's a few hours. Everything will be gone by nightfall, and your lawn will look better than ever. In fact, we're adding some decorations. Consider it a free makeover." Jake didn't respond. He just turned around and went inside, slowly closing the door while his mind spun. This wasn't the first time Karen had overstepped. She'd fined neighbors for having trash cans out an hour early. She'd reported someone for using wind chimes that were too loud. But this was war. Jake pulled out his phone and started making calls. Not to the police. Not yet. First, he needed to understand how deep this went, and what he found made his jaw drop. Turns out Karen hadn't just taken over his yard, she'd told the vendors and the entire wedding party that the backyard belonged to the HOA and was available for use. She even used HOA funds to pay for the tent rental. HOA funds! Jake smirked. That was a violation he could work with. But he wasn't done. Around 11 a.m., while Karen and her minions were arranging tables and taping fairy lights to his fence, Jake slipped into his basement. He had an old irrigation control system that connected to the sprinklers, one most people didn't even know existed. He programmed it to activate at exactly 1:35 p.m., just after the ceremony was supposed to start. But he didn't set it to just on. He set it to flush the entire line. Years of mineral buildup, rust, and brown sludge would be unleashed in a glorious muddy baptism. And then he waited. At exactly 1:30 p.m., a string quartet began playing. Guests in pastel dresses and rented tuxedos filled the chairs. The bride stood under the arch. Karen beamed like royalty. A hush fell. Then, shh, the sprinklers kicked on. At first, it was just a sprinkle. Then the gurgling began. Then chaos. Dark brown water blasted out of every sprinkler head, soaking the guests, the flowers, the buffet, the cake. People screamed. The violin screeched to a halt. One woman slipped on the mud and took out an entire row of chairs. Karen shrieked like a banshee, waving her arms and screaming at Jake's house like she could stop the system by yelling louder. Jake stepped out onto his porch, holding a mug of coffee and watching the destruction unfold with all the serenity of a man who had just reclaimed his land. Karen ran up to him, soaked and covered in mud. Her fake tan streaked down her face like war paint. "What did you do?" "I watered my lawn." "This is sabotage! This is criminal!" "No. What's criminal is using HOA funds to pay for your daughter's wedding and lying to every vendor about who owns this property." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish. Jake continued, "I spoke to the HOA treasurer. He didn't know anything about the rentals, but the invoice says HOA funds were used. That's fraud, Karen." Her eyes darted around, trying to find someone to back her up. The guests were too busy fleeing. The bride was screaming about her ruined dress. The DJ speakers were sparking. And then the cops showed up. Apparently, someone had reported a public disturbance and unauthorized use of private property. When the officers arrived and asked who was responsible for the event, Karen proudly stepped forward, thinking she was in the right. That changed real fast when Jake handed over copies of the vendor contracts, all signed by Karen using HOA credentials. The officers asked her to step aside. She started yelling, then crying, then blaming Jake, then blaming her daughter. At one point, she even tried to say she thought Jake had donated the space out of generosity. The officers didn't buy it. They pulled out a citation pad. Karen nearly collapsed when they started writing. One officer told her that the HOA would likely need to conduct an audit. Fraud was serious business, and if HOA dues were misused, there could be legal consequences. Karen babbled excuses until they asked her to leave the property, which she did, still shrieking about lawsuits and how Jake had ruined the most important day of her life. Jake stood there watching the last of the wedding debris being hauled off by muddy, angry vendors. The lawn was wrecked. The grass was toast. But Jake didn't care, because Karen was done. That night, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. Jake showed up with receipts, copies of the water system logs, and statements from 3 vendors confirming Karen's lies. The board voted unanimously to suspend Karen and to launch a full financial investigation into her time as president. Within 2 weeks, she resigned. By the end of the month, the yard was fixed. Jake threw a backyard barbecue, invited every neighbor who had ever been on the receiving end of a Karen tantrum, and grilled burgers while they laughed about the mud explosion. Karen's daughter? She had to reschedule her wedding, but this time they picked a real venue, far from Jake's lawn. And Jake? He finally had his yard back. And not just that, he had peace. Karen was gone. And the only thing left from her little wedding fiasco was a broken arch, a dead patch of grass, and the memory of a woman who thought she could steal someone's space and not face the consequences. Not in Jake's yard. Not anymore.